What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another Darktide video. In my last video, I talked about some tips and tricks for new players, and today I'm going to be continuing the theme and talking about tips and tricks to deal with every single one of the elite enemies of the game and explaining all of their strengths and weaknesses. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting a like and a subscribe. I talk about Warhammer 40,000 stuff of all types, including Warhammer 40k Darktide. Also, I'm going to use a lot of clips from my live streams. I stream almost every weekday over on twitch.tv/tacticaltortoisetv in evenings, US Eastern Time. So please come hang out with me over there. All right, let's jump into it. And for this video, I have broken down all the enemies into their particular types. We have a couple categories to talk about today, but first there are going to be some basic pieces of information that I have to give you. Today we're going to be talking a lot about scabs versus dregs. If you played a lot of the game, and especially if you have Sire Melk contracts, the difference between scabs and dregs is actually going to be very important to you. Scabs are the Mobian 6th Infantry. These guys are Trader Guardsmen. They're the guys wearing metal armor and usually have glowing green night vision goggles on their mask. Dregs, on the other hand, are the dregs of society that have been left behind on Atoma. These are the cultists that usually wear yellow rags. Today we're just talking about elite enemies, not the normal autogun or lasgun guys, but the difference between scab or dreg varieties of elite enemies, it does actually matter because typically their defensive characteristics are a little bit different. Next up, everyone in the game has an armor type, unless, of course, they're unarmored. Although we only have one unarmored thing to talk about. Those armors are broken down into categories, either flak, which is light armor, carapace, which is super heavy armor, and is oftentimes immune to very low damage weapons, especially ones without very high armor penetration. Maniac, which is a scaling armor class. It actually takes less damage from high damage attacks. It blocks proportionally more of the attack, so the way to deal with Maniac type armor is for a high volume, low damage attack. You can think like a recon lasgun would be pretty good against them. The important thing to remember here is not to heavy attack Maniac armor class, because they actually take less damage than they would just by swinging normally at them. Unyielding, which I'm not actually sure what the characteristic of. This is a damage resistance on the Ogryn, and I think it just gives a flat damage resistance. It's kind of a midway between flak and carapace armor. And last but not least, Infested, which actually isn't an armor type. It's basically an enemy categorization. It's essentially unarmored, so it takes full damage from everything, but their attacks will slowly corrupt you. This is basically just poxwalkers, bursters, and plague hounds. They're easy to kill, but you don't want to get hit by them because that corruption damage stays permanent unless you can find a Medicae station. All right, let's jump in with some enemy categories. First off, I'm gonna just dump all the miscellaneous enemies that don't really fit into a category in a big melting pot. Now, in my last video, I did talk about 3 particularly annoying enemies that can stun lock you almost indefinitely, those being the Plague Hound, Mutant, and Trapper. And I'm just basically going to reiterate what I said in my last video here. Plague Hounds jump on you and pin you to the ground, slowly dealing damage and corrupting you if you can't get out of them. But there are a couple ways to get your friends out of them. Although if you are immobilized by a Plague Hound, you're stuck. I'm sorry for your loss. Attacking a hound on its way to you or pushing it when it jumps, so using the block and then push, will actually stagger them and cause them to run away. Plague Hounds do take a ton of damage, and their critical hitbox is enormous because you can shoot them in their head as they're running at them very easily. Although sometimes they spawn right next to you and you don't have time to kill them before they hit you. If an ally is pinned by a Poxhound, you can get it off of them by A, hitting the Poxhound with a staggering weapon, a weapon with a high impact. Something like a shotgun or a Void Strike staff will work, but generally speaking, you just want to be able to kill them. If you kill them, your friend will get back up and you'll be fine. Mutants are a Maniac armor type. They have an insane number of hit points. They have a really tiny hitbox in the center, and they're going to pick a target when they spawn and just chase it down until they grab you, in which case they're either going to throw you or slam you on the ground repeatedly and make your life a living nightmare. The way to avoid their charges is to dodge right at the right moment before they contact you. 2 dodges is the best, since they have a pretty wide area that they will grab you in. If you're able to dodge, they'll actually stumble and stagger for a moment, and that gives you the ability to get in a couple hits and do some pretty serious damage. Although usually you won't be able to kill them in one cycle of this until your team gets involved. Now, Maniac Armor class is relatively weak to weapons that do damage over time, so things like chain swords, eviscerators, and force weapons, if they're charged up using their special attack, the first hit in will typically do less damage because the Maniac Armor class will block a lot of it, but the constant damage, ticks, small impacts of damage over time, those will typically stack up pretty heavily on mutants, and one or two of those, even on the higher difficulties, will knock a mutant down. Last but not least, we have Trapper, which is also Maniac Armor class. These will shoot a net at you that you can dodge. There's a pretty wide radius that you have to dodge, but it's not too hard, especially if you're paying attention to the audio cues. Sometimes, however, they spawn right next to you, and there's no way you can possibly dodge, so if they hit you with that net, they will lock you up and throw you on the ground. It only takes about 2 seconds to free an ally from a net, so if you have an ally who has been captured by a Trapper, probably go in and free them first before trying to deal with the Trapper. Trappers, they do have Maniac Armor class, which makes them difficult to deal with, but they don't have too many hit points, and you'll be able to get them pretty quickly. They also do a little happy dance if they grab somebody, so if they grab an ally, you typically have time to let them finish their celebration, untrap your ally, and then hit the Trapper on the head a couple times to kill them. All right, let's move on to some new enemies that we haven't talked about quite yet. First off, the Plague Burster. These are also called the Poxwalker Bursters in the audio. These guys have a bunch of bombs strapped to them that will explode in a pretty wide radius if they're able to get to you and jump on you. Obviously, you can hear the ticking time bomb that they have strapped to them, and the faster the tick goes, the nearer they are to you, the closer they are to detonating. Although they do have some control over this, so if you run away from them, they will actually deactivate their bombs, and the ticking will slow down before they explode. The easiest way to kill them, especially because they're infested and take full damage from basically everything, is to shoot them with guns. Then they'll just die, and that's very sad for them. If they're right on you and you can't stop them, however, once they jump, just like a dog, using a block plus push and then dodging backwards will actually get you to the edge of their radius and limit the amount of damage that they do to you. So as they're in midair, pushing them away will bowl them on the ground, and then you can dodge back. Next up, the Sniper. These guys are the bane of many a run and have ended a ton of runs with some lucky shots on the team. Although, interestingly, they do friendly fire, and they shoot through every character in the game. Although some characters like Ogryn are actually immune to their shooting using their big slab shield, they do still shoot through the Ogryn and hit people behind them, which doesn't really make sense, but it is what it is. Hilariously, they can also kill dozens of Poxwalkers if they so should happen to just fire through a horde, which certainly happens pretty often. Obviously, the Sniper's biggest sell is the laser sight on their rifle. You can see it from a mile away, and dodging out of the way will typically force them to re-aim and give you a couple more seconds before they shoot you. There's also a lens flare and an audio cue, just like all ranged weapons when they go to shoot, and dodging out of the way should be okay, but the timing can be very difficult to hit. Snipers are unarmored and have some of the lowest hit points out of any of the elite enemies in the game, so shooting back with almost any ranged weapon is almost immediately going to kill them. You basically have to engage them with them at long range, though. Oftentimes they will try to keep their distance from you, and they'll spawn in annoying places behind grates and other difficult to get to places, so having a sharpshooter on your team that can deal with them immediately as soon as they spawn, or even just a psyker to brain burst them at a really long distance, is pretty imperative. Otherwise, you're going to be just trying to fling bullets at them. Eventually you'll kill them, but it does kind of suck. Next up, the Bomber. These guys also have ridiculously low hit points. They do have flak armor, so a little bit of damage reduction, but most attacks will kill them pretty quickly. They'll throw a bomb that has a quick countdown before exploding and leaving a huge AoE of fire. The first hit from the fire, if you're inside the AoE, will knock down all of your toughness, and then it will continue to do health damage to you until you die or move out of the AoE. It is a little annoying that the AoE is so large, especially since bombers, if you hit them in mid-throw, will actually fumble their grenade and drop it on their feet. This does damage them and potentially kills some friendlies around them, but it can also hurt you, especially if you're engaging them with a melee attack. Interestingly, it might be better for you if you're trying to get to them with a melee attack to wait for them to throw their grenade over you before you hit them. Otherwise, when you hit them, you'll probably kill them, the grenade will go off, and you'll lose your toughness anyway. It is important to lock down the Bomber as soon as they throw their grenade, because oftentimes they will just turn around and run away as soon as their payload has been delivered, which means that they'll continue to harass you and stack up those big AoEs and eventually stack up additional bombers as new bombers spawn if you don't deal with them. And having 2 or 3 enemy bombers hiding behind grates, chucking explosives over the top of walls and things like that is absolutely nightmarish. So definitely try to kill them as soon as you hear that ticking grenade go off. Last but certainly not least in this category are maulers. These are the big heavily armored guys with the 2-handed chain axe. Now these are where we start getting into some interesting armor classifications because they have flak armor everywhere on their body except, importantly, their head, which is protected by the much more survivable carapace armor, which makes engaging with them a little counterintuitive. Generally speaking, you would headshot enemies to try to deal critical damage and kill them easily, but if you don't have good armor penetration, attacking a mauler on the head actually does significantly less damage than normal, and many weapons without high armor penetration actually do not do any damage on a headshot. Generally speaking, you won't want to body shot a mauler multiple times repeatedly until they go down. They do have a boatload of hit points, so if you can't kill them before they get to you, mostly just dodge their big axe. Their attacks are enormously telegraphed and super slow, although they do have a relatively long range, so you do have to kind of keep your distance from them to avoid those attacks hitting you. 1 to 2 hits from them, especially on higher levels, will probably kill you, so keep that in mind. All right, let's move into some more specialized enemy categories, and starting with the Flamers. Now, interestingly, both the Dreg and Scab Flamers have the same armor type. They both have Maniac armor, and as far as I can tell, have the same number of hit points, which means that dealing with them is basically the same either way. The Dreg Flamer is a Tox Flamer. It fires a green flame that I believe have a longer lasting AoE in addition to the regular damage that they'll inflict. The Scab Flamer just has the regular flamethrower, which I think does a little bit more damage, but doesn't do any of the corruption that the Tox Flamer does. Being maniacs, these guys absolutely love to telegraph their attacks. They'll scream at you something about flaming, and they'll tick their igniter before shooting, so you'll have a chance to respond. That said, while they're shooting their flamer, they do actually have a little bit of redirection they can do, so even if you're dodging left or right, they can typically follow you, and oftentimes you'll just run away. And oftentimes you'll just run a Fuck, I'm so bad at this. Oh my god. And oftentimes you'll just want to run away until they're done blowing their load all over the screen. If you can stun them or get in close before they fired at you, that works best. That way you can keep them off kilter before they can drop their annoying AoE of constant damage, which basically, just like the bomber's AoE, will knock your toughness down if you touch it and continue to deal health damage and or corruption, depending on which type of flamer it is, the longer you stay inside it. Interestingly, staggering them or hitting them midstream actually interrupts their flow and can make them less accurate or make the AoE that they're projecting smaller as they don't shoot the entire jet. Once you get in close, just watch out for their tiny attack animation. It's a little elbow jab, which is basically hit scan, and because it doesn't have too much of a telegraph, it's very difficult to dodge. So if you're fighting them in melee, try to keep them staggered or dodge behind them while fighting. Just like the other maniacs, having a low damage weapon is the best against these folks. Next up, we have Ragers. These are the guys with the 2 big one-handed chain axes and come in 2 separate categories. The Dreg Rager, which is maniac. These guys just have rags on them, sometimes some gross tentacles coming off of their body, and obviously have that maniac armor class, so you want to be shooting them with little guns rather than big single hits. And the Scab Rager, which is covered in flak armor. These guys are pretty cool looking, actually. They have big spiky helmets. The defining feature of the Rager is that they're pretty much immune to stagger, and especially once they enter an attack animation, they'll just keep swinging combos for a while that do massive damage if they connect with you. Blocking helps, but they attack so many times that they'll drain your stamina pretty quickly, so shooting them to death before they get to you, or dodging and then finishing them off with ranged attacks is usually your safest bet. If you also have damage over time weapons that can kind of continuously stun lock them in a damage received animation, that will also help, although oftentimes Ragers come in with huge swarms of enemies to make this very difficult. Next up, we have 2 similar categories of enemies. These are gunners and shotgunners. Now, as far as I can see, these are basically defensively the same between the 2 categories, but obviously their weapons are different. And just like Ragers, there is a divergence between the Dreg versus Scab varieties. Dreg gunners wear flak armor on their torso, but their head and limbs are entirely unarmored. So these ones, you want to typically go for headshots. Scab gunners, on the other hand, have unarmored legs, but flak armor on their upper body, torso, and head, so they're a little bit tougher to kill. You can take advantage of the unarmored legs by shooting them there, but the body shot damage is typically better because while they do have flak armor, you do still take more damage on your body than you do in extremities in Darktide. Gunners attack by setting up a shot and then letting loose a long, almost uninterrupted volley of bullets or lasers from the volley gun that pushes you back, staggers you, and damages you if you're unlucky enough to be inside it. The important thing is to try to disrupt them before or during firing so you can interrupt that stream and actually make some headway against them. Otherwise, it's best to keep your head down while they're shooting because eventually they'll have to reload after a couple seconds. These enemies make it very difficult for you to engage into even if you have a long-range weapon or something like a sharpshooter, since they will continuously disrupt and stagger you even as you're getting hit. You basically just need a way to interact with them without jumping out of cover. Psychers are pretty good at this, and so they can grab their head real quick with a brain burst and then run away. Shotgunners are similar in that they have the exact same armor as other gunners, so their defenses are basically identical, but their gun is totally different. Being a shotgun, it's low rate of fire and it's very telegraphed. You get the lens flare and the audio ping as you do with all the ranged attacks, but if it hits you, it has insane damage and huge knockback. They also tend to typically spawn in high numbers and operate very aggressively, so prioritizing them early in a fight helps a lot. Just like the big gunners, the scab shotgunner is wearing a lot of flak armor, whereas the dreg shotgunner actually has no defense on its head or arms, which makes them a little bit easier to take down. Last but certainly not least, we have one more category of elite enemies to talk about in Darktide, these being the Ogryn enemies. These are also known as the unyielding enemies because they have unyielding armor class. Sometimes are just the big, huge dudes that you got to deal with, and especially at mid to higher levels end up being like sort of mini bosses you have to get through before you can progress in a mission. These include the Crusher, which has the big two-handed rock on a stick. The difficulty for these guys is that they have carapace armor everywhere on their body. They're probably the most difficult to kill elite enemy that you'll get to until you start hitting monstrosity enemies. You need weapons with good armor penetration, or ways to deal damage without attacking them with normal weapons, things like the Psyker's Brain Burst. If you don't have that, it's going to be tough because you're basically just relying on your weapons to critical hit to do a little bit of damage over time, but the Crusher has an enormous ocean of hit points you have to get through, and that makes it extremely difficult. Their attacks are huge and very telegraphed, but are difficult to block, and if they connect, will do a ton of damage. You can dodge them pretty easily because they take basically 10 years to actually hit the ground, but obviously if you're dealing with a lot of enemies, they can connect with you, and that's absolutely brutal. Especially on higher levels, having something that can deal with Crushers is absolutely imperative to making a balanced team composition, because so many weapons, especially guns, will just bounce right off of their armor at long range. Now, speaking about the other two Ogryn subclasses, these guys have interesting armor where the Crusher is carapace armored everywhere. The other Ogryns are actually kind of WYSIWYG armored, where everywhere you see a big steel plate is going to be carapace armored. Anywhere else on their body is unyielding, which is just a hefty damage reduction, although not quite the same as carapace armor. This includes the Bulwark, which has that huge, enormous slab shield that makes them entirely invincible from the front and actually even immune to some status effects. The shield hitbox of the Bulwark is super wonky, so try to engage them from the sides or back. They also have armored arms. You can see armor plating on their upper and lower arms, which makes it a little bit more difficult to engage them from the sides as well. You have to be sort of shooting down below the belt, I guess, or going for headshots. Their unprotected back is the best way to deal damage to them, but it is unyielding armor class, which makes them a little bit tough to get through. The other good way to do it is if you have a stagger effect. A lot of heavy melee attacks will do this. That will actually cause them to drop their shield, open up their body, and that gives you free reign to shoot their chest or head, which is where you're going to deal the most damage. Last but certainly not least for this video, we're going to talk about the Reaper. This is basically the same as the other gunner classes like the Scab or Dreg machine gunners, except it has a Reaper autocannon. That's normally a weapon that Space Marine Terminators carry, but the Reaper's got a big one, which is effectively the same as the machine guns, except obviously just with higher numbers. It does a little bit more damage, it has much heavier impact, and much longer effective range. Reapers are interesting because while they do have some carapace armor on their arms, especially their one big shoulder pad, their chest is protected by chainmail, aka flak armor, which actually against a lot of weapons has less damage reduction than the unyielding armor that the rest of the body has. So basically for most weapons, the best way to kill these guys is to go for body shots. While their heads do allow for critical damage, the flak armor on their chest is actually lower damage reduction, and so they'll eat a lot of damage from that. And for some reason, their gun doesn't typically block bullets, even though it is an enormous piece of metal. And so shooting them right in their chest, as long as you don't hit those armor plates on the arms, will do a bunch of damage. And these guys typically go down to like a ton of bricks. As long as you can engage them while their stream of bullets isn't hitting you, you will be able to kill them pretty easily, especially if you have a pretty solid sharpshooter who can use their special ability, get a bunch of damage, especially critical hit damage, shoot them in the head a couple times, and that will remove the Reaper from the situation. And with that, that's every elite enemy in Darktide. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know down in the comments, and let me know what type of enemy you want me to talk about next. Big thanks to everyone else who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. I love you all, and you're great. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy dark tidings. Have dark tidings. That's what I should say. Dark tidings to you.